I want to show you what might just be the most important landscape in the United States. It's dripping with history, and it's beautiful in its own way. But it makes you ask, how could this happen? March 1st, 1872. President Ulysses S. Grant signs the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act, designating the country's first national park. Except this wasn't really the first national park. Let's rewind a bit. California, 1849. Settlers are pouring into the West, and one city is growing faster than any other. As gold becomes harder to find, miners push deeper into the mountains and deeper into the territory of the region's indigenous groups, prompting those groups to resist. With more and more conflicts breaking out, the federal and state governments come to the miners' aid, destroying villages and resources, and forcing indigenous groups into reservations. In early 1851, California's governor forms a militia led by trader and miner James Savage. The militia follows the Merced River into the Sierra Nevada mountains, hoping to find and capture Tenaya, a chief supposedly taking refuge in a sheltered valley. The pursuit eventually brings them here. They spend 2 days exploring the valley. They give it a name, a word they've heard used by the indigenous groups living here and incorrectly assumed to be their name for the valley, Yosemite. And they return with descriptions of cliffs and waterfalls thousands of feet high. Those descriptions eventually reach James Hutchings, an Englishman who settled in California and become a gold miner. After losing most of his profits in a bank crash, he's looking for new opportunities and sees potential in publishing and tourism. In 1855, he makes an expedition into the valley, accompanied by an artist from San Francisco and 2 indigenous guides. The next year, he runs an article in his magazine describing the valley in detail. He predicts that before long, this will become a famous destination where people can escape the urban world and experience the sublime beauty of the mountains. That same year, a wagon road opens, and tourists slowly begin to trickle in. The next year, the first hotel opens. Hutchings continues to publicize the valley, inviting prominent scientists, writers, and artists, and before long, it does become quite famous. At the start of the 1860s, Frederick Law Olmsted, who's famous for designing New York City's Central Park, is pushing hard for protection of Yosemite Valley as a public park available to all Americans. His efforts, along with the work of prominent writers and artists, eventually convinced California Senator John Conness to introduce a bill to Congress. And on June 30th, 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signs that bill into law, ceding Yosemite Valley from the federal government to the state of California on the condition that they preserve it for permanent public access and recreation. The term national park isn't used here, but the vision is undoubtedly there. The Yosemite Grant is the first flickering of an idea that will come to be described as America's best, the preservation of land for its beauty alone. This is a story about national parks and other public lands here in the United States. And if you've been paying any attention to the news, public lands have been in there. Every day there's something new, and it can honestly be tough just to keep up. I'd like to stay as informed as I can about American public lands, but also just environmental news broadly. And one of the tools that's helping me to do that is the sponsor of today's video. Ground News is a website and app that aggregates news stories from all around the world. It tells you about different outlets' political leanings, their credibility and factuality, who they're owned by. As I've been working on this video, the Trump administration has been moving to increase logging in national forests. This story's been covered by 166 sources, with the majority in the center and not many on the right. Most of those right-leaning sources quote the administration's claim that increased logging will help to control wildfires, while many of the sources on the left cite studies concluding that logging is not an effective method of fire control. One of my favorite features is blind spots, which highlights stories disproportionately covered by either side of the political aisle, stories you might otherwise miss entirely. Like this story from a couple weeks ago about dams in the Pacific Northwest struggling with understaffing following widespread firings of federal employees. You'll notice that this story wasn't covered by right-leaning outlets. This is actually somewhat connected to this video, but you'll see why later on. All of these tools are helping me to broaden the stories I'm consuming and stay more informed on environmental, science, and just general news. Right now, Ground News is offering 40% off of their Vantage plan using the link in the description of this video. That's all of the tools we just talked about for just $5 a month. That link is ground.news/Aidin, or you can just scan the QR code on screen. Thank you again to Ground News for making this video possible and just helping me stay informed. John Muir moved from Scotland to the United States as a child, working on a homestead and in a factory before leaving to explore the country's new territories out west. He's read about a famous valley in California and boards a ship to San Francisco. Muir finds work as a shepherd before being hired by Hutchings to work as a sawmiller, all the while spending long days out exploring the surrounding landscape, writing journals, and making sketches. He writes about wildfires destroying forests, spring floods submerging the valley floor, a large storm causing the canyon walls to tremble with hundreds of temporary waterfalls, earthquakes tearing pieces from the mountains. He recounts climbing onto a thin ledge to view a waterfall from above, being swept back to the valley floor by an avalanche. He makes some of the first ascents of the surrounding peaks, finding new glaciers and planting stakes to measure their movement. He theorizes on the valley's origin, believing it was carved by massive glaciers during the last ice age. To prove this theory, he documents glacial landforms, boulders on the tops of mountains, and long scratches in the cliffs. In 1871, Muir publishes his first piece of writing, an article detailing his theory that ancient glaciers carved this valley. His work quickly catches the attention of prominent writers, artists, and scientists. In the following decades, he publishes more articles, gains more popularity, and leans harder into conservation. He writes of unchecked livestock grazing eroding Yosemite's meadows, loggers felling the country's largest trees. In 1890, his writing leads to the designation of Yosemite as a national park, expanding its protections and its boundaries. Early national parks were a mess. Creating the illusion of an untouched wilderness meant evicting indigenous groups from their traditional lands within the parks. Sloppy boundaries and unclear regulations allowed private interests to exploit park land. Shepherds continued grazing livestock across Yosemite's meadows, and in 1903, a timber company started logging within the park. Muir continued highlighting the damage being done to the landscape and pushing for stronger protections, reaching more and more Americans. The damage being done to the country's indigenous groups wasn't something he felt the need to protest. Thanks in part to Muir's writing, urban Americans in cities across the country were growing to appreciate the wilder landscapes nearby. In 1892, a group of outdoorsmen in San Francisco formed the Sierra Club, selling guided trips to the mountains and using the profits to fund political activism. Muir was one of the club's founding members and its first president. The same year, Muir meets Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot comes from a prominent family, and he's decided to become a forester. This job is unheard of in the US, so he spent the past year and a half in Europe, touring forests in Germany and Switzerland, and studying at the French School of Forestry. Returning to the States, he's appalled by what he describes as reckless mismanagement of the country's natural resources, forests being cut as though they're infinite, and anyone who suggests otherwise being ridiculed. He spends 3 years managing George Vanderbilt's private estate in North Carolina. During this tenure, he meets Muir. The two spend a few days together in the Adirondacks, bonding over a shared vision of protecting the country's landscapes. In 1896, the Department of the Interior funds the National Forestry Commission, tasked with surveying the West's forests and advising the government in their management. The commission includes both Muir and Pinchot. They spend 4 months touring the country, both writing of memorable days among the country's wildest landscapes, sharing a love for these places and discussing ways to protect them. Muir believes that much of the land they're surveying should be completely protected from extraction, while Pinchot envisions managing these resources so that they can be harvested sustainably. The two remain good friends, continuing to exchange letters and take hikes together. In 1898, Pinchot became the chief of the country's Division of Forestry. This was a tiny division with almost no funding, but he gradually scaled it, recruiting young forest rangers to help. Rangers were barely paid. They often had to buy their own supplies and build their own cabins. Congress ensured rangers were overworked and underfunded. The beginning of Roosevelt's presidency in 1901 gave the rangers more funding and much more authority. Pinchot's division became the Forest Service, overseeing 60 million acres of land. 5 years later, that had grown to 180 million. Early rangers really had their work cut out for them, as homesteaders and industries flooded into the West to cash in on free land from the government. Massive corporations bought up huge chunks of that land, sometimes fraudulently. Timber companies put up fake homesteads. Mountain tourism became more popular, often based on the model of the European Alps, with railroads, scenic roads, and hotels providing comfortable access to dramatic scenery. Rail access allowed tourism in Yosemite to accelerate rapidly, and the country's environmental movement continued to grow. As San Francisco continued to grow, it was increasingly controlled by banks, businesses, and wealthy elites. Among those wealthy elites is James Phelan. In a few years, he'll be elected mayor, and he has a vision for San Francisco. A massive imperial city, harvesting resources from the surrounding landscape and exporting them all over the world, supporting a thriving urban society. But there's one problem. The city doesn't have water. The only decent water source near San Francisco is Mount Tamalpais. Each morning, water vendors scoop water from the mountain streams and pedal it around the streets of San Francisco in water carts. In 1858, George Ensign founds the Spring Valley Waterworks, selling water from a small spring in San Francisco. He's bought out by a larger company, which then merges with another, and the Spring Valley Water Company quickly becomes quite the monopoly. San Francisco hates Spring Valley. They're constantly in the papers for deceptively buying land, exploiting eminent domain, bribing city officials, and charging way too much for water. For this city to have any chance of becoming the futuristic metropolis Phelan envisions, it needs an abundant source of fresh water, owned by the city itself, not Spring Valley. Phelan's vision of San Francisco is inspired by Europe's old empires, particularly Rome. He looks at the Sierra with its gushing rivers of spring snowbelt and imagines the Roman aqueducts, bringing abundant fresh water hundreds of miles from the mountains to the city center. In November of 1872, Muir sets out on yet another trek, this time leaving the Yosemite Valley for 10 days. He walks more than 40 miles, crossing over the mountains before descending into the canyon of the Tuolumne River. Where the canyon widens, he enters the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Cliffs tower more than 2,000 feet high. A waterfall plunges 1,700 feet into the valley, even more powerful and spectacular than Yosemite Falls. On the valley's floor, a calm river winds through a quilt of forests and meadows. exiting the valley through a narrow canyon. So narrow, in fact, that during spring floods, the water backs up, turning much of the valley into a large, shallow lake. He describes Hetch Hetchy as nearly an exact copy of the Yosemite Valley. But this valley isn't famous. The next year, Muir published an article detailing his visit. In the following decades, he convinced friends, artists, and scientists to visit and share the valley. But with no roads or hotels, no commercial boosters, and no recognition in tourism guidebooks, Hetch Hetchy remained mostly unknown. The closing line of Muir's 1873 article encourages others to visit the valley, to ride a few miles out of a direct course, to assure oneself that the world is so rich as to possess at least 2 Yosemites instead of one. (1901). San Francisco Mayor James Phelan applies for a permit from the Department of the Interior. He wants to build a dam on the Tuolumne River, submerging the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Interior Secretary Ethan Hitchcock denies the application. He argues that Hetch Hetchy is in a national park, and the park legislation clearly states that this land must be preserved for recreation. San Francisco appeals the decision, and Hitchcock denies the appeal. By now, Phelan has been replaced by Mayor Eugene Schmitz, who determines that because of the national park, Hetch Hetchy just isn't a realistic place for a reservoir. So the city shelves the idea and starts looking elsewhere. April 18th, 1906. A magnitude 8 earthquake strikes San Francisco. Buildings, power lines, and water pipes are destroyed, and a large fire consumes several square miles downtown. Roughly 3,000 people are killed, and 200,000 are left homeless. With water lines broken, firefighters struggle to control the fires, and the city wastes no time placing blame. City officials put together a committee to investigate the disaster and the lack of water. The committee concludes that Spring Valley is not providing the city an adequate supply of water, and recommends the city find its own source of water as quickly as possible. City engineer Marsden Manson sees an opportunity to revive efforts to dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley. He knows that building a dam in a national park won't be easy. He'll need help convincing the federal government, someone well-connected, whose opinion on public lands commands attention. So he phones a friend, Gifford Pinchot. In November, Hitchcock is replaced by James Garfield, a friend of Pinchot, who'll be more open to San Francisco's requests. The Sierra Club moves to fight the project, reaching out to environmental clubs across the country for support. They distribute pamphlets containing photographs and Muir's writings about the valley. Muir writes directly to his friends in government, including President Roosevelt and Chief Forester Pinchot. Roosevelt, Pinchot, and Garfield are all in support of San Francisco, on one condition. They want the city to start by damming Lake Eleanor, a large alpine lake near the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Once Lake Eleanor is at capacity and the city needs more water, they can develop Hetch Hetchy. San Francisco agrees, and in May of 1908, Garfield approves the project. Next, Congress will need to approve the transfer of land from the national park to San Francisco. January 1909. Congressional hearings begin, and Manson drops a bomb. San Francisco will only take the deal if they can immediately develop Hetch Hetchy, completely reversing on the promise they made Garfield just months earlier. The Sierra Club quickly rallies public opposition, flooding members of Congress with hundreds of letters each. The next month, the debate moves into the Senate. The opposition is better prepared, assembling a lineup of prominent advocates to testify on the valley's behalf. They emphasize not just the valley's beauty, but its potential for tourism, envisioning a network of trails, scenic drives, hotels, fishing, a massive loop road connecting Hetch Hetchy to Yosemite Valley. Shortly after the hearings, President Taft takes office, replacing Garfield with Interior Secretary Richard Ballinger. Muir shows Taft around Yosemite, then takes Ballinger to Hetch Hetchy the next week. After these meetings, he believes he's won their support. As the year comes to a close, 2 engineers from the U.S. Geological Survey present Ballinger with a study expressing doubt about San Francisco's plans to dam Hetch Hetchy, suggesting the city is biting off more than it can chew. It's not looking good for San Francisco. So, in February of 1910, Ballinger gives the city a task. Prove it. Prove that you need this much water. Prove that you need it right now. Design the reservoir and explain how it will impact the national park. August 1912. 2.5 years and several delays later, San Francisco presents their report. Unfortunately, it's a work of art. It's written by John Freeman, one of the country's top hydraulic engineers. 400 pages. The first 50 are photos. Beautiful landscape images of reservoirs in England, Wales, and the Northeast. Fjords and alpine lakes in Norway and Scotland. The images are accompanied by writing articulating a pretty game-changing argument. A reservoir won't ruin the valley, it'll improve it. The Hetch Hetchy Lake is sick. It's got easy highway access, beautiful scenic drives along the water's edge, hotels and campgrounds overlooking the water. We've even got concept photos showing what the lake would look like. The scenic roads, bridges over the waterfalls. The city distributes this book, making sure everyone in Congress sees it, and winning many of them over. For years, activists had fought against this project using crafted prose and images. Freeman beat them at their own game. The Sierra Club responds with their own report, but they have neither the time nor the budget to put together anything near the scale of Freeman's. Within the Sierra Club, things have been tense. Many of the club's members live in San Francisco and actually support the dam, including Manson. The guy leading the charge to dam Hetch Hetchy is a member of the Sierra Club. Worst of all, rumors are circulating that the activists opposing the reservoir are being paid by Spring Valley. There's no evidence to back those rumors up, but it's not looking good for the Sierra Club. After reading both reports, Interior Secretary Walter Fisher decides that he doesn't have the authority to authorize the Hetch Hetchy project, and leaves it up to Congress. San Francisco drafts a bill. California Senator John Raker introduces it. A lineup of San Francisco city leaders show up to testify, along with Pinchot. The Sierra Club distributes more than 20,000 pamphlets. Senators receive thousands of letters. December 6th, 1913. The Senate votes. 43 yes, 25 no, 27 abstained. 2 weeks later, President Woodrow Wilson signs the Raker Act, transferring Hetch Hetchy Valley from Yosemite National Park to the city of San Francisco and authorizing the construction of the reservoir. Pinchot's support was significant for the passage of the bill. Muir and the Sierra Club had repeatedly invited Pinchot to meet with them, join an outing, and see Hetch Hetchy for himself. But he never did. Muir died just over a year after the bill passed. The Raker Act does have a few big caveats. Once completed, the reservoir must remain open for public recreation, and San Francisco has to build recreation infrastructure. A public road accessing the reservoir, a scenic road along its edge, and an extensive network of trails. The water and power generated must be supplied directly to the people of San Francisco. The city cannot sell it to a private water or power company like Spring Valley or Pacific Gas and Electric. Just keep those stipulations in mind as we move into this next section. San Francisco hired Irish-American engineer Michael O'Shaughnessy to lead the West Coast's largest civil engineering project, building a massive dam deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains and moving water 167 miles to the coast. Construction crews built a network of roads and a 58-mile railroad into the valley, a camp for more than 400 workers, and a tunnel to divert the river. They excavated the valley floor, digging down more than 100 feet to reach the bedrock below. To complete the aqueduct, 2,000 workers blasted a 29-mile tunnel through the mountains. The First World War brought significant inflation and a labor shortage. Costs ballooned, with the dam O'Shaughnessy initially estimated to cost $3.5 million, eventually costing more than $10 million. It quickly became clear that Freeman and O'Shaughnessy's plans were way too ambitious. Not only did San Francisco not need something of this scale, they couldn't afford it. To move forward with construction, city voters had to approve the funds to pay for it, but they repeatedly voted no, leaving the city struggling to fund the project. To spread out the cost, the city decided to get the reservoir's power production going before building the aqueduct. The completion of the powerhouse in 1923 left San Francisco residents suspicious. The whole point of this project was to bring them water, but now the city seemed to be stalling. In order to start supplying that power, San Francisco had intended to buy the private power company Pacific Gas and Electric. But once again, voters weren't willing to approve the funds. So, in 1925, the city just started selling the power from Hetch Hetchy to Pacific Gas and Electric. In 1927, city officials posted signs closing some areas around Hetch Hetchy to hiking, camping, and fishing. The national park removed the signs. This back and forth continued, with San Francisco repeatedly attempting to close Hetch Hetchy to the public. At the same time, the park continued to remind the city about those roads and trails they agreed to build. And in 1930, they finally reached a deal. The city just paid out the park, leaving the decision-making to them, so some of the funds ended up being used for improvements in other areas of the park. October 28, 1934. The Hetch Hetchy system begins supplying water to San Francisco. Construction lasted 19 years and cost 89 lives. After the passage of the Raker Act, activists didn't just go home. They kept pushing, focusing on stronger protections for national parks to prevent this from happening again. In particular, it was clear that the parks needed their own agency separate from the Forest Service and Department of the Interior. December 1915, Senator John Raker introduces yet another bill to Congress, the National Park Service Organic Act. It outlined a clear mission statement for the parks: to conserve scenery, natural and historic objects, and wildlife, and to leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And it established the National Park Service with the sole purpose of fulfilling that mission. In 1919, 2 dams were proposed in Yellowstone National Park. The Park Service fought the projects, joined by environmental groups, and neither of the dams were built. The Second World War reduced the Park Service's staff and resources by more than 75%, and saw a spike in attempts to extract resources from the parks. Soon, the Park Service found itself fending off attempts to log the old-growth rainforests of Olympic National Park. In 1943, the Army Corps of Engineers announced plans to build a dam in Glacier National Park, submerging 20,000 acres of forests, meadows, and park facilities. The National Park Service opposed the project outright, joined by environmental groups and local tourism interests, and the dam was never built. In the 1960s, a collaboration between federal and state governments proposed to build 2 dams in the Grand Canyon. Yet again, the Sierra Club fought the project, with lawmakers receiving thousands of letters from pissed-off Americans. The federal government responded by having the IRS threaten to revoke the Sierra Club's nonprofit status, prompting a flood of backlash to the government and of donations to the Sierra Club. The dams weren't built. Most national parks were established using land already owned by the federal government, but in my home state of North Carolina, the Park Service took on the task of building a park out of privately owned land. The process took 17 years and involved raising more than $10 million to purchase the land, 85% of it being bought back from a handful of timber companies. In the redwoods, protection of the world's tallest trees depended on individual philanthropy, with the Save the Redwoods League buying up 170,000 acres of old-growth forest. In 1963, a National Geographic expedition advocated for the establishment of a national park by finding a world record tree in a logging forest. Redwood National Park was established 5 years later. With each new park added and each new environmental battle fought, the mission statement for the parks gained clarity. Visions of Roman aqueducts, French forestry plantations, and Swiss gondolas were left behind, replaced by a uniquely American approach to public lands. In 1992, Congress passed the Elwha River Restoration Act, removing the lower Elwha Dam in Olympic National Park and draining its reservoir. Today, salmon runs have returned, and the surrounding valley is recovering. Many of the country's dams are getting old. Their reservoirs are backed up with sediment. Their structures are weakening. They need repairs. And in more and more cases, the best path forward is removing them. November 1987. Interior Secretary Donald Hodel proposes removing the O'Shaughnessy Dam and restoring the Hetch Hetchy Valley. This created quite the political buzz, generating both backlash and curiosity. The state and federal governments funded studies assessing the economic and environmental impact, but with lukewarm support and loud opposition, the idea was mostly forgotten. In the 1990s, a handful of Sierra Club members formed the nonprofit Restore Hetch Hetchy, aiming to garner national support for restoration efforts, a mission they continue today. If a Hetch Hetchy restoration does gain enough support to move forward, it will be one of the most ambitious restoration projects ever attempted.
Walking around here, it's been really easy to get into these pockets where the reservoir is hidden. You can't see the water. And it kind of, just for a little bit, feels like it's just not there. Like you're seeing what this place looked like in the past. And maybe, just maybe, what it could look like in the future.
Hetch Hetchy is remembered as one of the greatest missteps in the history of American public lands. And yet, there's no evil in this story, no greedy corporation pillaging the mountains. It's a story with so much nuance, yet it reveals something so simple, that some places are just special. Over the last several months, we have once again seen our public lands and the people who look after them antagonized. We have once again seen attempts to underfund and overwork rangers, to open new land to exploitation, to act with willful disregard for our ecosystems, for endangered species, for indigenous communities, for our country's past, and for our children's future. There are hundreds of places where the dam wasn't built, where conservation won. So many of our favorite parks and forests only exist because people devoted themselves to stop them from being logged, mined, drilled, paved over, privatized, dammed. This valley is a reminder that we can't afford to take these places for granted.